This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is prison reform, and I have two men who will speak about it. The conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is prison reform. I have two guests, Malcolm Feely and Shad Maruna, who will be speaking about it. I like to give my guests a couple of minutes to just say who they are, what they do, and why they're here. So let me start with you, Malcolm. If you could give a little background about who you are and anything you've written or done in the criminal justice system.
Okay, yeah, I'm Malcolm Feely. I'm just retired at the University of California at Berkeley in a PhD program in the law school. And I've spent most of my career looking at criminal justice reforms. I wrote a book on court reform on trial. I wrote another big book on judicial policy making and prison reform, and lots of articles and other books related to that. And I'm currently writing a book called Entrepreneurs of Justice: How Private Contractors Have Made and Remaking the modern criminal justice system, looking mostly at England and the United States.
My second guest is Shad Maruna. Shad, if you could give a little background about who you are and anything you've written or done within the field.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm as of September, the head of the Department of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminology here at the University of Liverpool. Everything I know, I've learned largely from Malcolm Feely and his work and colleagues. But I have done a little bit myself now over the years. I have I'm probably best known for a book called Making Good that came out in about 2001, and looks at people's experiences coming out of prison and how formerly incarcerated individuals turn their lives around after prison. Followed that work up with a number of other studies. Most recently, did a large-scale study of people inside prison during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So let's just talk briefly, historically speaking. If you look back into the history of prisons, and not political prisoners necessarily, although we could include them, but criminal prisons, has there always been issues throughout every country, everywhere, at every time in people demanding prison reform that the rate of incarceration or the types of incarceration have been unfair? Shad, if you want to take that first.
Okay, I mean, I'd probably defer to Malcolm on this, but yeah, I think it's, if I understood the question, I think it's fair to say yes. As long as we've had prisons, we've had demands for prison reform, and to the point that some would say the two go hand in hand in lots of ways. That the prisons seem to be with us forever, as does the crisis in prisons and the need for prison reform. I certainly can't think of any context in which there weren't such demands in the history that I'm aware of.
Malcolm?
Um, that's right. My old colleague Shelley Messenger used to say the prison is the only social institution he knows of that at the day of its birth it was declared a failure, and it's been declared a failure ever since. But nevertheless, we continue to rely primarily on prisons. Having said that, prisons are brand new institutions. They haven't been around forever, at least for mass punishment. They're an invention of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of historical work now, and transportation, that is, exiling convicts or selling them into limited term slavery from England, and then later in a different form in Australia, existed for as long a period as the modern prison is listed. So the prisons are brand new. The mass prisons for mass incarceration are relatively brand new. In the past, they were for political prisoners and special, enemies of the state. But for we have societies that have never thought of punishment and immediately thought of prisons because prisons didn't exist.
You mentioned slavery, and a lot of people compare a lot of the modern prisons around the world with slavery, that they're often used for slave labor. Modern for-profit prisons too have been accused of this. Is that something that is a natural outgrowth of the modern prison system?
Um, well, I think there's a path dependency, but the first mass punishment, the first punishment that could be used systematically for large numbers of people in England, and the colonies were still small, was not execution, because people got in the 17th century. By the mid 17th century, execution had radically declined. In my view, the great reform of criminal justice in England was not in the 18th century, but in the 17th century, the 1600s, when execution rates tumbled after the Tudor regime. The and then the new invention, given the crisis of law and order, was when merchants discovered the need for doing something about criminals, and at the same time discovered that there was a great labor shortage in the colonies, and so they created the punishment of transportation by saying they would take people. If the crown would pardon somebody after convicted and being sentenced to death, they would take people to the New World, and if the people could pay, and if not, they would sell them into a limited term slavery. And from that, transportation took off, and 65,000 people went to the North American colonies until the American Revolution brought a sudden end to that. But that was the first form of mass punishment. And incidentally, was not a benign substitute for executions, as the historians, the Whig historians say, at least. It was an add-on. Capital punishment continued at more or less the same rate, and this dramatically caught up people that wouldn't have been tried and convicted at all, or if convicted would have served a period in the stocks or a few days in a local jail. And so the modern prison has its origins in entrepreneurs trying to make a buck off convicts, and and at least in the United States and England. Let me suggest that the weak states, and England and the United States, were great believers in laissez-faire in the weak states and strong markets, and so they depended on the market to provide a public good, that is a service for punishing offenders. And it's from that the modern prison grew. The first comprehensive, thoughtful design of the prison, never executed incidentally, was by Jeremy Bentham. And we're all familiar with his design of the panopticon, but the more interesting part of his plan was that he thought he was going to get filthy rich by having the monopoly contract to run a factory in his prison. And from day one, prisons have been organized to try to see that prisoners paid for their upkeep. And as the state got stronger, that turned out to be a failure. But the early prisons were organized, and so today's prisons are fantastically good in comparison to, say, the early prisons in England, 19th century prisons in England, or the convict lease system in the United States, where 10%, 15% of the population in the convict lease would die every year. So if you're sentenced to a 10-year sentence, there's a good chance it was a death sentence.
Shad, to use a current term, intersectionality, has there always been an intersectionality between forced labor and prisons?
Interesting. I'm no intersectionality expert, but yes, I certainly race and incarceration in places like the United States, although similar patterns exist everywhere, and then of course gender. So when we think about forced labor inside prisons, it is largely an African American or a minority male situation, and so in that sense, yes, it is deeply entwined with both race and class, race, class, and gender, I should say, and that is a similar situation as I mentioned across multiple jurisdictions around the world. Michael Tonry is one of the chief researchers in the domain of race and crime in terms of tracking this pattern, and he has shown that the disproportional incarceration of racial minorities is a pattern that can be found all over the world. But yes, it's particularly striking in the United States, and the continuity there for with slavery, with Jim Crow has been an important subject, certainly since Michelle Alexander's fascinating book, The New Jim Crow, Jeff Ward's research on Black child savers and the origins of juvenile justice system, the intersection, as in your word, between race and punishment is deeply enmeshed in the structures of American criminal justice, and also the kind of the culture and the imagination of punishment in the United States. And so, in some of Ward's newer work, he's looked at the continuities between slave-owning states where the KKK has been active, where there were lynchings in the 20th century, and incarceration rates and disproportional minority incarceration rates in particular. And these things are very highly correlated. That the same regions where we saw lynchings, where we saw slavery, are also those with investments in mass incarceration, and those kind of parallels are hard to explain away.
So, Shad, the late 19th, early 20th century was sort of the end of the Gilded Age, the start of a more progressive era. We had things like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, talking about corruption in the meatpacking industry. Did prison reform get started in that era here in the U.S.?
I defer to Malcolm on this. I'm not a historian, and I wasn't alive myself at that point, but it would have been, yes. I mean, that is the era of some of the great reformers, for sure, of John Howard and others internationally. Malcolm, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Two things. I mean, I'll push back a little before Shad to say something. One has to think of prisons themselves as reforms. A prison was a 19th century, early 19th century invention that replaced ad hoc form of punishment. In England, that ad hoc form of punishment was mostly transportation or not doing anything. But prisons dramatically increased the state's capacity to punish. And built in to the idea of the prison was that a convict excluded from society had to pay for his room and board. That was just built in. Now, the prisons have never been good at that. In the 19th century, England was the most wealthiest country in the history of the world. And it finally had the ability to build big prisons. It built big prisons, and the plan was to put the convicts to work. Convicts are not real motivated, they don't work hard, and so they had the treadmill that became gratuitous punishment. People would just walk around singly, or they would pick up cannonballs and carry them from one place to another, or sift sand pick up sand and put it through a sifter, and then pick it up and put it through a sifter again and again. It turned into be a form of punishment and very little productive labor. The invention of the prison in the United States was more successful, because they rather than the state running them, they had prison contractors who ran prisons as factories and were very successful. All these things, and then the most successful was the convict labor. The richest man in Kentucky in 1855 was Zebulon Ward, who had the monopoly contract for contracting out prison labor. He got wealthy, and then and so the model, interestingly enough, the model of convict leasing and working prisons began in the North and the East, and it was had virtually no black people in it. Blacks in the South were subject to slaves, and even some free blacks were subject to private forms of punishment that did not involve the state. So the modern mechanism of the prison and the gratuitous punishment and the extraction of labor began without slavery, because slavery was still a separate. But in the United States, after the Civil War, the Reconstruction government, that included a number of blacks in power, decided they wanted convict leasing system, and then that expanded, and that's when it became a black phenomena. I now have
This being chain gangs, you mean?
no,
No,
not chain gangs.
no.
Chain gangs were a benign innovation.
Mm.
You have to. These were. Let me give an example. I'll give you the most extreme example. In the 1840s and 50s, convict leasing in Alabama and Tennessee operated by putting people building railroads and working in mines. The company that came out of that, or that absorbed that, of which this was a part, was later the United States Steel, owned by J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. They made their money by convict leasing. That is, the state would give a contractor handfuls of convicts at no price or at a nominal price. He in turn would lease them to various businesses, who then would take total care of them. They'd take them out in the work camp near the railroad or near the mines, and then work them to death. In fact, there's a book that called Worse Than Slavery. There was no investment. There was no investment in convicts. There was an investment in slaves. So that's the title of one of the classic books in the Southern prisons in the early 19th century. That came to an end. Convict leasing came to an end, not because it was scandalous and there were calls for reform. There were reforms, but because the states realized that they weren't making any money. They were giving convicts almost free, and the convicts were then working for the companies, and the companies were getting rich. And some thoughtful statesmen realized that they were not getting. Alabama had been the one exception, and so they said, "Well, we're going to." So the great innovation, and normally thought of as a reform, and certainly the reformers at the time celebrated it, was to take people off convict leasing systems and put them in control of the state, where the state ran the plantations, and that's when the great plantation prison model started. So Cummins Farm, Parchman Farm, Tucker Farm in the South were all old slave plantations. The state ran them, but the state ran them like a private contractor. They made a lot of money too, in a sense that existed in some states up until the 1960s. But that was regarded as a great reform by the reformers of the early 20th century in the United States.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like the inherent flaw baked into the system from the start was the reliance on capital labor within the prison system, or the extraction.
The idea of the prison is that we will keep somebody in prisons, and they will, and because the theory that you see in some of the old texts is because by the goodness of our hearts we have spared your life, you must work for us to pay your keep. this was and entrepreneurs invented this and used it. So the prison has always been an entrepreneurial system, and I think it continues today in much better case. So today's prisons are a world apart and much better than the early prisons and even the earlier the convict leasing systems.
And
And
here,
there were variations, and many of the sort of the chain gang. So it was a sort of a variation of that used by county jails rather than state.
so what was some of the major reform movements in the 20th century, Malcolm?
Yeah, well, one of the great reform movements was to replace convict leasing with prison farms, which meant the convicts were no longer, and that this took place between about 1895 and about 1930, or the other was taking people off convict leasing and putting them into making roads for the state. So it moved from private contracting to state to state control. But the reason that the old convict leasing failed and the so-called reform took place is because convict leasers got greedy, and they kept upping their price when they were selling leasing the convict labor to where it was just below the market level for free labor. There were lots of Italians and Irish coming into the South who would work very cheaply, and so prices of labor were going down, and prices free labor and prices of convict labor were going up to where there was just a marginal difference. But free labor had one advantage. You could fire your workers at will. If a company hired or leased a group of convicts, they were responsible for the period 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever their sentence was. And it turned out that the people contracting for the labor were losing money, and so they didn't want convict leases anymore. They wanted free labor. And the reform of the state-owned prison farms, was a result not of a desire for a better prison, but the failure of the market a market failure during periods of recession that led to the change. I'm a very cynical person, but that's what the record clearly shows.
So let me turn to you, Shad. In modern prison systems, you have maximum security, you have minimum security, you have these different layers. Has that caused a problem? And has there been ever? I bring this up especially now, in the last year or so, the last few months since the new administration took over. But people have always looked at violent criminals, the pimp on the street, the drug addict who mugs someone, as somehow being inherently worse than the white collar criminal that steals away $10 million from some company or some government program. Is there an inherently baked in flaw in separating criminals? In that manner, Shad?
That's a really interesting question. An inherent flaw, yeah, probably so. We talked about intersectionality around class, and you put your finger on it in the sense of we can call things prisons, and yet that word prison has a huge variety, and so there are things called prisons in Norway, or indeed what minimal security prisons even in certain states in the U.S. and in the federal system that look absolutely nothing like the maximum security prisons that they share a name and some very basic functionality, but there is a vast difference between types of prisons, and there's a huge correlation in the types of people in terms of age, race, background, certainly social class, types of crime that impact where somebody finds themselves in that spectrum of different prisons. So yes, I loved Malcolm's description of the history of prisons, very much revolving around money, and I share his cynicism in that. The other, of course, fundamental of the prison, and justified from its origins as reformative, as a way of allowing people to sit with their thoughts and read the Bible, contemplate the Bible in silence. It is isolation, and so we have prisons in the United States called not just maximum but supermax prisons and maximax prisons, and the United States has taken the idea of isolation, of solitary confinement, to levels that were unthinkable even in the origins of the prison, when we justified, again, solitary confinement as a reform, as a rehabilitative method, as Malcolm said. The Nelson Mandela rules of the United Nations suggest that a person shouldn't be kept in solitary confinement, and by that it means more than 22 hours of isolation without meaningful contact with other humans. Shouldn't be kept in that kind of isolation for more than 14 days. In the United States, people are routinely sent for years into isolation, and not just because of behavior inside of prisons, violence against officers or the like that some might find credible, but for fears of their involvement in gangs and networks, that the fear that they could have a contamination effect, confine people in maximum security, isolation, 23-hour lockdown, where they're only allowed into a small space to get a breath of fresh air for an hour a day. And again, yes, these aren't the white collar offenders. These aren't bankers who led to the collapse of the economy. These are very consistently poor minority males of a very clear pattern that it can be seen, and so I think your suspicions are very much warranted in terms of that differentiations within the system. Yeah.
Malcolm, a few months ago, I did a show with an ex-prisoner, a former EMT who got hooked on drugs and started dealing, and he spent like 3 years in jail in California. And I was wondering, what effect did the drug war of the last 50 years have, and what effect did mandatory sentencing, things like the three strikes rule, did that just explode the prison population, and would these be considered almost anti-reform movements?
Well, look, one person's reform movement is another person's anti-reform movement. I lived in California here during the shift to determinate sentence, and I lived here during the three strikes. And the people that thought they were doing that thought they were reforming criminal justice and making the public much safer. But they certainly exploded the prison populations in this state. The drug war had a dramatic effect. But let me go back and say one thing. The United States and drug addicts and drug users. I mean, this is terrible. We're still now, years later, going back revising some of the draconian sentences that are bringing people we've forgotten out that were stuck in long mandatory minimum sentences and for three strikes, and so the state largely as a cost measure and a population management measure is trying to locate those people if they haven't been totally forgotten and removing. But the United States is a very, very violent country. It is a very violent country. It was built on violence. It was built on violence to Native Americans. It was built on violence to slaves in the South, and it reflects in our culture. And you know, you, you hear about a murder in Northern Europe, once a month or something. It makes the newspapers, if that often. And here it's around in every community, and it doesn't even make the newspaper unless it's particularly heinous. So we have a big problem with violent people, and locking violent people up in violent places is our response of choice.
I think I read somewhere that in the almost 250-year history of the country, there's only been like 8 or 10 years where this country has not been at war officially or unofficially.
Yeah, yeah. You mean war on crime?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's probably true. Look, there's always a crisis of law and order. It's one of those things. I've been reading early modern English history and early American history, and the crisis of law and order is a continuing thing. Of course, one of my inclinations is to follow the great John Braithwaite's advice and not complain about the leniency of white collar criminals, the way they're treated, but say that we ought to try to treat all criminals like we treat white collar criminals. We ought to use that as the model for imprisonment, not that we ought to make.
I think Sweden does that, do they not?
Well, all the Norwegian countries do that, but the Norwegian countries are or the Nordic countries are benign and have very little. Incidentally, the crime is increasing in the Nordic countries, and they're getting relatively tougher. But by us, they're a piece of pie or a piece of cake or something. But again, they don't have the violence and the social pathologies that affects such a large share of our population. And incidentally, they deal with sociopaths in a different way. That is, the Nordic countries have a much higher rate of custodial treatment of sociopaths than we do. We don't have much of that, but we stick them in prisons, not mental institutions. And of course, their mental institutions are really good, but we don't have some.
The old saying about prisons making better criminals. Let me just step back for a moment to talk, because if we talk about prison reform, you have to talk really about justice reform, since one is a subset of the other. About a quarter of a century ago, I worked as a county clerk in Minnesota County court that eventually was merged when Jesse Ventura became governor into the state system, and it screwed it all up. But one of the things that I remember is one of my duties was, after 7 years after turning 18, I had to go and shred documents of the juvenile offenders. And I saw some really, because I'd have to look for certain things that could carry over into adulthood possibly to save. And I saw some terrible things. I remember one thing, a girl who was like 13 or 14 years old, this is in like 1974, stole a sweater at a Target. And she was immediately incarcerated. She ended up, over the course of a 6 or 7 year period, becoming a drug addict, becoming a violent criminal, several suicide attempts, and then she succeeded. So within a matter of 6 or 7 years, she went from an average teenage girl who made one mistake into a suicide. And the notes on the judge, from the judge, were just so tone deaf. So I just use that as one example of tens or hundreds of thousands, probably, of similar stories. And this was a white female suburban girl in 1970s, Mary Tyler Moore's, Twin Cities. What larger scope can we pull out to do justice reform that would then maybe inherently contain prison reform within it, if any?
Okay, that's a good question. I have in front of me the rate of incarceration for each of the states, and I'm just going to hold it up if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Uh, you see where it is? Not surprisingly, Mississippi and Louisiana are up there at the top, and the southern states are up. This is the rate per 100,000.
Yeah.
Incidentally, Minnesota is just down about here.
Yeah.
It's one of the top 10 best. Okay, and that's what you find. And I presume that wasn't even in Hennepin County.
It was Hennepin County, actually.
Is that right? Okay, but think of it. Minnesota is the model.
Yeah.
It has the most Nordic-like criminal justice system in the United States, in part because there's so many descendants of people from Nordic
And
countries.
that's a scary proposition, because, as I said,
That's right. No, that's
if they're the best, there's something really rotten in Denmark.
They're the model. They're often the model. It's one of the 2 or 3 models of in the. On the other hand, let me give a story about a jail, not a prison. I taught at the University of Wisconsin for a while, and the first year or so turned out I had a deputy sheriff in my class, my undergraduate class. So he invited the entire class to come out to visit the jail, and had took the opportunity because here he was, a sheriff that was going to show us around. And so I drive out a little earlier, and I drive up to the prison. It's about at 9 o'clock in the morning. There is a parking lot the size of a football field, and it's empty. And I walk in and I meet my guy, and I say, well, I don't think we're between shifts, are we? He said, no. Then I said, why is that big parking lot empty? He says, oh, that's a prisoner's parking lot. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they stay here at night, and they go into Madison, Monona, around and work, and then come back in the evening. So the parking lot's empty. And it turned out that 85% of the inmates worked during the day and came back in the evening. And then my next question is, what if they don't show up? He says, the single largest explanation is because they stop off at a bar with their buddies from work and miss curfew and don't get back in time. And so we know which bars they go to, so we go pick them up. And if they repeat that a couple of times, we keep reminding them what will happen if they keep doing that. And then we take them down to the holding cells down next to the courthouse, which are these little 8x10, barred jails. He said, so once they've learned that, or once they've experienced they're more likely to pay attention to the rules. So 85% of the jail population was out working. They paid like $10 a day for room and board in the jail, and they got, they could have lunch with their girlfriends or parents or whoever during the day. So that was in operation since 1908, called the Huber Law.
Shad?
And I don't know if it still exists. I hope it does.
Shad, do you want to comment?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to throw in another bit of good news, because obviously there's not a great deal of good news, but probably the biggest story that has rarely been told in terms of justice reform in the last 100 years has been what's happened around youth, the story you told is absolutely right about the young woman and the shoplifting, and this is a well-established pattern in terms of criminological research, where we've known for at least 30 decades, maybe more, that the worst thing you can do as a society, as a state, if you want to turn around somebody's budding, youthful juvenile delinquency is to saddle the individual with a criminal record, even worse, to take them away from their school, from their employment, incarcerate them, and give them that socialization experience, but worse, the stigma that comes with that. And there's literally dozens of studies that demonstrate that criminogenic effect of early incarceration experiences. And the good news is that the world, including most U.S. states, has woken up to this this really toxic problem, and we have seen the rates of juvenile incarceration just tank over the last 15, 20 years, to the point that there are jurisdictions here in the UK where you can't find anyone under 18 incarcerated. It's really been this remarkable story that the states should be celebrating and singing it from to the roofs, but they would rather keep it secret and do this quietly, because the public isn't always on board with the latest criminological research. But we've seen no increase in youth crime as a result of this. In fact, youth crime is dropping remarkably as well. The two have gone hand in hand. We've got young people who are behaving differently than we've ever seen young people behave, and so part of this is a reaction to them, but part of it is that their behaviors are a reaction to, we're not incarcerating that young woman for shoplifting as a way to turn her around, a way to, we used to talk about it as scaring kids straight, or teaching them a lesson by sending them away, and then they'll see the error of their ways and turn around. Those kind of efforts to scare young people turns out to have a criminogenic effect, and does the opposite of what we hope for. So that has been a really good story, and we're starting to see rates of young adult criminality decline, along with the fact that we have fewer what used to be called state-raised youth. These are young people who have been incarcerated, locked up in juvenile lockups from the time they were 15. What do we expect them to be doing when they become adults? In today's world century, have fewer of those on the streets. We're starting to see a decline in young adult criminality, which is the peak age for criminal involvement.
Well, I know, Shad, you had said that you need to go earlier, so I want to ask you both a final question and then wrap up.
Right.
I know that having read just as a layman, it seems to me that the direction that 21st century reform, at least here in the U.S., is going in regards to prison, is to get more granular, down to more individuated solutions to individual people. Because the person who gets in a bar fight and accidentally kills someone, manslaughter charge, is fundamentally different than a mobster or a terrorist or a serial killer or a pedophile rapist. These are all things that need more fine-grained solutions. And one of the things that I've read, and it seems a bit odd, but maybe it could help, is that a lot of people are thinking of applying AI as an all kind of cure, that in terms of looking at these kinds of convictions and trying to put it into some way where you could maybe I don't know, help. That to me seems a risky thing. So let me ask Malcolm, what have you heard about these kinds of things?
Look, the criminal justice. Now we're shifting to the prosecutor's office. This doesn't begin in correction, but prosecutors have always, I think, distinguished between stranger to stranger offenses and acquaintance offenses. Mm-hmm. And if you in New York City, there was one interesting study that found that 40% of felony arrests were dropped outright. Very few of those arrests were dropped because of lack of sufficient evidence. They were almost all on substantive judgments. And if prosecutors in New York looking at this would make the distinction between technical felonies and real felonies, and said technical felonies, we had to have social workers deal with them, not us. And so they would drop them. And those often involved quite serious cases, but they involved thefts of a boyfriend from a girlfriend after they broke up, or taking the car keys, or coming into the apartment and stealing stuff. So there were always excuses, or acquaintances that had too much to drink that got in fight somebody. So unless it was really serious, the prosecutor would drop it. And if he didn't drop it, there was a good chance that he would lower it from a felony to a misdemeanor. I used to teach American trial court judges from all over the country every summer, a 2-week course, and I'd have them read that, and they would react with disbelief. And I said, okay, when you go back home, take the last 100 felony arrests that had been brought into your courthouse, and tell me what happened to them. And if the profile you see for New York City in the 1970s, doesn't hold for your courthouse, I'll send you $100 bill. And I said, it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be variation, but if that general pattern doesn't hold, and I got back lots of notes said, don't send me $100 bills, because it does fit for us. And so I think whether AI can do a better job than prosecutor screening, probably, because they generally put the rookie prosecutors in those screening places, and they make lots of mistakes. So AI could do better than them, probably. But it's there, and it's a good thing. There's vast discretion in the criminal process, and it's exercised usually for good and usually rather quietly. Because prosecutors in their public persona will say, we do what we have to, we have no choice. But the fact is, they have vast choices.
Shad, let me just end with you and ask this final question to wrap up. When we get to the midway point of this century and then the end of this century, do you think that especially here in the U.S., that prisons will be fundamentally different? Will lessons be learned? Are you optimistic?
No, I'm certainly not optimistic, so I can answer that one. You'd be a fool to be overly optimistic in this world. And I mean, I guess I've been in and around prisons and prison reform for 2.5 decades or more. Malcolm's been at it longer than I have, but I find that it's very much a process of a couple steps forward and then a couple steps back, and there is a constant. I have a lot of concerns about the domain, but prisons become criminal justice more broadly. The war on crime. It's a catch-all. It can do everything for every situation, and it's obviously deeply emotive for the public, and therefore it's deeply politicized. And so, we're very early days in this current administration, but two of the many worrisome things that one sees have been the transfer of prisoners to El Salvador, and the show that involved. Obviously, there was the situation with the judge and telling him to turn back the planes, but why even there was this need to identify a prison system that seemed even harsher than the harshest of U.S. prisons, that makes a big show of the dehumanizing way they treat people and their care, and that was seen as a deliberate vote getter, something that would rouse the public and support. Makes me depressed that I work in this field of prisons. There was something grotesque about that hope that we could humiliate people, and that would be a positive thing for the public and so forth. And then, of course, the way that the people were chosen for that without any transparency, without any what we would consider a civilized rule of law. That we were not even told what evidence on which they were made, transferred, and so forth. The other concern, of course, is the involvement of the justice system and ICE and the dealing with student protesters on campuses and how we're seeing the justice system involved there, where we don't have evidence of students breaking laws, but rather are voicing views that are unpopular with this administration, and where we're seeing these or open air arrests and so forth of these young people, and those sort of events in were early days filled me with terror. It does suggest there is a kind of the powers of the justice system, and in particular incarceration, are so extreme, and the temptation to use them for these kind of penal populist purposes have been around forever, and yes, I fear that we could be in for another increase of mass incarceration in future years.
Well, I want to thank you both for spending about an hour speaking about prison reform. I will link to both. I will put links for people to reach you below this video. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan.